Okay, good. So that's one of 4 things we're going to do this evening. Done. Number 2 is I want to share with you a brief prepared statement. I don't usually read a paper. I just want to share a few thoughts with you this evening. The 3rd thing will be self-explanatory, and the 4th thing will be this presentation, which should soon appear before you on this screen, called Wonderful Wooden Wrecks. As Paul mentioned, both of us have new chapters coming up in our lives, myself included, and so I want to read a few words of appreciation. First of all is thanking the Whitney Laboratory for sponsoring such wonderful community outreach like this, and to thank Paul for putting that all together. Indeed, a cornerstone in the community. It's been my honor to live and work in St. Augustine, St. Johns County in Florida since 2007, not that long ago. I met my current boss, Chuck, in graduate school. He hired me and got me down here in 2007, where I've been working as a project archaeologist with a wonderful team of people. Through that process, I was inadvertently accepted into the community, I think, became a part of it, met many new friends, and indeed some of those who are like family. Community is our bedrock of civility, and it's a good touchstone we should remember when the podium is often used for vitriol. Things like tonight return us back to civility and to community. St. Johns County and St. Augustine has a strong community. Includes native Floridians. There are probably a few here tonight. Much new blood, myself included. Lots of people, tradespeople, scholars, historians, biologists, etc., but all people that are part of the community. And it's with a torn feeling that Lily and I will be leaving the community and moving to my home in Virginia, back to the old family farm this November. We really enjoyed being here. We will miss it, miss all of you. This community is extraordinarily special, and we're lucky to call it home. I want to thank the St. Augustine Lighthouse and Maritime Museum for being a home to research, and to me and my colleagues since 1999. That's how long LAMP has been in business. And I want to thank you all for being such good community members and sponsors of maritime archaeology. We couldn't do it without you. So tonight I want to share some of that research, some of the things that we've been doing fairly recently, and some of the things that the Lighthouse sheds light upon, pun intended, through its active archaeological research program. I want to share why I think shipwrecks are interesting, not only because they're interesting and because they're shipwrecks point, but because I believe they have ties to why and how society and social networks are important, how they define us, and how they help us craft a path into the future. So if you'll permit me, I normally give a formal presentation, but not tonight. We're at the beach. This would have been a lot easier to do if my microphone or my thing worked here. And so I'm going to address, as I normally do, on the beach, on the boat, and underwater. So if you'll bear with me just a second. We'll get the presentation. There we go, that's a little better. Any minute now, you're going to see a picture of the presentation here. If you want to do PowerPoint, you can switch over that. Okay. So I see that most folks have visited the lighthouse, and I encourage you, if you have not, to visit it, not to sell tickets, but because I believe that our lighthouse is a museum, and I believe that museums are naturally the repository of communities' histories, in our case, a maritime history. We have in our collections over 18,000 artifacts, not a huge collection, but a very important collection, over 7,000 images relating to St. Augustine's maritime past. And the lighthouse is kind of an iconic center for a very broad history that reaches down to the Caribbean, over to the Old World, and throughout the modern American society. So here we have wonderful wooden wrecks. So we know where we are. This is the group that I work with. This was this summer at the end of our field school. We had 10 students join us from all over the United States. We've had international students before, And on our new to us vessel, the Empire Defender, we went out to sea for about a month, trained students in how to dive in our non-cerulean, non-clear waters around here, but most importantly, taught them how to do science underwater. And this was the end of the field school. We do all sorts of training with students. This is a University of Virginia student who is learning how to operate a side-scan sonar, and we have, there we are offshore during one of our routine days. We would have been offshore today had the wind not been blowing, but the team does say hi. They were up on Little Talbot Island recording a new old shipwreck that had been exposed by the recent hurricane. So we need to start in the beginning with the wreck I'm going to talk about tonight, which is known as the Spring Break wreck. So we step back to Old St. Augustine. This is a wonderful image painting you can see down in Daytona, the museum there of the old inlet. You can see the fort and, of course, the lighthouse there in the background. Our inlet is special. All inlets are special in their own way. Ours has been described by this gentleman in the 1780s. And those of you who have seen me talk or Chuck talk before have probably seen some of his words that he wrote about the St. Augustine Inlet. I'll let you read that one there. He doesn't spare much in the way of ink in terms of describing. This is not what the Chamber of Commerce once printed about their town, but I think it's accurate. He continues by saying, without the least overstatement, I dare say every 100 paces, maybe a bit of an overstatement, but the skeleton of a foundered ship or its wreckage may be seen. Who could pass this way without emotion? And if one imagines himself the terror so many souls have suffered here and the lives that have been here lost, the estimate is that every fortnight a vessel is wrecked upon the coast. Now this is the part that, after 6 years of reading this, still gets the hair up on the back of my neck. He says, should the sea withdraw after centuries, it would be an astounding thing to come upon the relics. That's exactly what we do. And so with that, here is the map of our old driveway. This is our front porch. I don't know if we have a laser on this thing. We do. It's our old front porch right there, and the inlet going into downtown. You can see the Castillo de San Marcos there and the modern-day lighthouse in that area. So it's a ship trap, as are the seas around us. I saw this evening in the little mini nor'easter we have blowing right now, a shrimp boat wallowing offshore to catch our next salad topping. And we have here in 1944, I believe, the schooner Deliverance, bound from Bermuda to Jacksonville, I think it was, and it missed the Jacksonville Inlet by only about 15 miles. Ended up on the beach. We've worked with that wreck. Here is another wreck to the south of us that many of you from Flagler County might know about, the Nathan Cobb, wrecked in 96. And almost as if a bad spot is a bad spot is a bad spot, it would attract another vessel in exactly the same spot. This post marks the site of the wreckage of the Nathan Cobb. And about a year ago, the shrimp boat AMG ran up. This picture was taken by the Daytona News Journal from almost exactly the same spot that depiction of the Nathan Cobb was. And here I've ghosted it onto the image. See two wrecks on the same spot, a dangerous intersection on the Atlantic. About 2 years ago, it was a normal morning. I was in a staff meeting. You know how exciting those are. And a text came through that rescued us from the doldrums of indecision and drew us to the beach. I passed my phone around showing the picture that FWC had just sent us, and I said, boys, our day is about to change. And this was the picture that Tom Pitchford sent me. Big gleaming piece of wreckage that the Atlantic had burped up on the beach. Now, everything that we work with is not under the Atlantic or under the sands of the Atlantic, as we frequently do work with those. We get the unscheduled wrecking. This was unique for, I think, a bunch of purposes. So we're going to go through what we have learned about the spring break wreck, and kind of dig into the weeds of what it is and what I think that it was. Another image that day, it drew a crowd. I try to put pictures in here of just the wreck, but it was hard to do because once we start recording it, crowds showed up instantly. And on the third day, which was a Friday, I believe, we got a call from the sheriff's office saying, you guys need to move this thing because people are about to get run over on A1A. We are counting now over 1,000 people a day, 1,000 cars per day stopping to visit the site. Hence its name, the Spring Break wreck. They had sheriff's deputies up there guiding traffic, and I spent as much time, if not more time, interpreting what we were learning about the wreck to site visitors, which is a good thing. We enjoy that interest. So I should actually read 1,000 cars per day. A lot of media picked up on this. This is unplanned stuff, so our PR team was energized, and we had folks coming from from Europe and South America, journalists that stopped in to see this wreck that we had not planned. Former Secretary of State Ken Detzner dropped by. There's our Director of Archaeology, Chuck Mead, giving him a tour of the site. Most of you know that it has since been removed to the Guanatolomado-Matanzas National Estuarine Research Reserve, GTM, north of St. Augustine. If you haven't been there, you go north on A1A until you see the GTM sign, past the last gas station, turn left, cross the dam, and you'll find the wreck behind what looks like a horse fence. And it looks about like this. The University of South Florida Digital History and Heritage Center came up, and they were one group which helped us 3D scan this thing, and that's a fairly new technique. In fact, we've got Eric Wilson in the audience tonight that's been working with us to develop a lot of kind of groundbreaking 3D imagery of various artifacts and things that I can't bring in here to show you, but I can bring in here a cool image of what they are, and you see them in many ways better than a photograph. This is, by the way, a still. We could rotate this and zoom into it, and with great accuracy be able to take measurements from it, which is cool because there's often measurements you'd wish you'd taken in the field that after the fact you can't get. And with this software, you can get that. Pretty phenomenal stuff. This is what the wood looked like when it came out of the ocean. And with the exception of being wet and a little bruised by the ocean, looked pretty new. And we've got some markings up here in the upper right photograph. This is something that would have been put on by the shipbuilder, by shipyard workers to be able to assemble the wooden vessel comprised of tens of thousands of pieces of individual wood. Not something you always get to see on a shipwreck, kind of the human element. Where I took the research was a portion of our research was into the wood analysis, because that's what we have. We have a bunch of wood, right? Well, what does it tell us? What species are we looking at? How was the wood processed? Where did the wood come from? How was it assembled? What was used to assemble it? All these sorts of questions that, if answered like clues at a crime scene, may be able to lead to a conviction of the who, what, when, where, and why of this wreck. We haven't answered all those questions, but Dr. Lee Newsom certainly helped us answer some of them. She is a MacArthur Genius Awardee and is probably one of the best internationally renowned experts on wood taxonomy, identifying species of wood, and she lives in St. Augustine and works at Flagler College now, kind of an emeritus position. But she was very kind and allowed us to take samples of the wreck, bring them to her lab, and we worked together with these little razor blades that in a lab you have to call microtomes, and shave off samples of wood, put them in her $40,000 Olympus microscope, and then be able to look at them in thin section. If you don't know how to operate a microscope, this is the first thing that I saw. And so you see these little crystals, which really look like diamonds under about 200 power magnification. And those are salt crystals. This is the chlorides that are in the wood that have soaked into that sponge-like wood that after they dry out, they diffract light and look like little diamonds. This is a sample of a wood that has been dried out, which is one reason that we frequently tell people if you encounter wood on the beach, it is best if it stays wet, because if it doesn't, this happens. It turns into kind of dust. We're getting a little bit better resolution right now. This is what dried out wood looks like, and there's not a thing in the world I can do with that, or even Lee. This is what it should look like, and that is from the same sample. One was dry and one was not. So that's if you don't take care of it, and that is if you do. If you do take care of it, you can look for various aspects of the wood that will tell you things about it. I have learned to say this: never try to conceal your secrets in a tree or with a tree. Because number one, they usually live longer than we do, and they will share those secrets with future generations that know how to evince our secrets stored within. We took a total of 25 wood samples, trying to sample from each major component of the wreck. and note these attributes: species, processing marks, and the type of cut. In other words, how the wood was extracted from a log. So the first is species identification. One of the things that I am learning is trees are they're very complex. They're extraordinarily complex creatures that can convey up and down and back and forth throughout them with varying cycles throughout the year, utilizing various chemicals and hormones and all of that to do lots of things. They act and they respond and they speak. So if you know how to look at a tree and its cross tangential and radial sections, you can learn the language of wood, and you can learn the lexicon of wood study, neat words for bar trivia like tracheids and dentate rays, things that are really not meaningful until you start compiling all of the pieces of information. So the softwoods that we encounter on the wreck include spruce, white pine, and yellow pine. And here are the various pieces of the wreck: an outer hull plank, a hull plank, wood surrounding a copper tack. Those are the individual samples. We have hardwoods, American beech. That one was a real head scratcher. Out of 251 wrecks that Dr. Newsom has worked with, this was the second that had beech in it, and the first that had beech as a major structural component. We had white oak. That's the old standby for ships. White oak and live oak, wonderful woods for shipbuilding. And then one unidentified wood, probably some dry, damaged beech. So of the wood species, let's take a look at what they mean. So they're native to North America, all of these. That's good for us. It helps define where we're looking. We have a lot of hard, durable woods. That's expected. But American beech is very dynamic when it cures. So if you cut a beech tree, and by the way, those things are slow, relatively slow growing, and they are a wonderful tree to carve your name into. I don't advise you doing that because it lasts. Some friends of mine just finished a survey up on a military base in Virginia where they were finding tree art from World War II that was still surviving in beech trees. But anyway, if you cut one of these things and saw it into logs and boards and whatever, don't put it into something immediately because it has a very high shrinkage factor. And so you don't want to pair that with something that's very stable, because you can develop a very dynamic zone of interaction that can tear and break the things that try to connect them together. Our white oak, the old standby, is a fairly flexible wood. It's hard, it's durable. It's a principal shipbuilding timber. It grows throughout the East Coast for the most part, has a high resistance to rot, but only is found in trunnels on spring breakwood, and a great amount of that was what we call juvenile wood, so wood that would come from branches or younger trees, not the old growth you find inside of the old granddaddy oak. And that's, of course, what we know white oaks to look like, Quercus alba. White pine is wonderful stuff. Grows in the northeast for the most part, in the mountains of the southeast a little bit. Often used for Christmas trees, as you'll see. It's an extraordinarily stable wood. It's a light wood, often argued during the colonial era that it makes a better house than oak because you can make big beams that are lighter and thereby put more into the house without sacrificing the weight that oak brings. It's also easier to work with tools. It has lots of good things. One of them is not rot resistance. So why you would put white pine into a ship is beyond me. And it also is usually not found below the waterline, places where you will encounter rot. And we find that pervasively throughout the spring break wreck below the waterline. And there's our Christmas tree, white oak, eastern white pine. Yellow pine is what the southeastern United States, that's the bread and butter of the southeast U.S. Naval stores, turpentine, and all of that from this area all the way around the Gulf of Mexico. The longleaf pine, the southern yellow pine group itself, really, if you allow them to grow to maturity, which we are way too impatient to do nowadays, you develop a wonderful wood that is really durable and very long-lasting. Those of us that grew up in houses or have houses with heart pine floors or furniture know that, and it will form as good of a floor as any white or red oak. In the early 20th century, we were bringing wood out of the American Southeast Planks typically up to 60 feet long. Imagine a 60-foot-long plank in this room would take up, I imagine, most of that. That's where you had to load it into the bow of a ship. So they had doors, basically, big ports in the bows of ship that would be opened, and the wood would shoot right in underneath the anchor all the way through the run of the ship, and then they'd caulk that door back up and take it up to Boston to be made into carriages and furniture, etc. Wonderful stuff. There's a mature longleaf pine tree. And as they would have naturally appeared in savannas here in the southeast, and then of course its cousin, the loblolly pine, more pervasive now than the longleaf. And this is an example of a sample of, this is, I believe that is longleaf pine. Some really cool things happen in that. You've got all these resin canals, and that is what gets the resin throughout the pine, and that's really what enables it to be preserved or preserve itself. It's turpentine, really, it's terpenes throughout the wood. And they go through these little, this is magnified, I think, 300 times, 400 times, maybe more than that. This is how sap gets in and out. But it makes a piece of wood like this, which is a sample from spring break wreck, last in the ocean extraordinarily well. Looks a little chipped on the edge and a little dry damage, but when we turn it and thin slice it, that's what the inside looks like after having been soaked in the ocean for well more than a century and a quarter. You can see that there's only seepage into the wood of less than a quarter inch all the way around, and when we shine light through it, we see all of that beautiful resin still in it. The black areas represent iron staining, where those little resin canals have actually transferred iron phosphate throughout and stained. It'll tell us where fasteners once were. Spruce, great stuff, but hard to find in southeastern shipbuilding. Most spruce that is harvested, has been harvested commercially, was way north from the arboreal forests of southeastern Canada, south central Canada, some from New York, Vermont, and Maine. And then you have isolated pockets of spruce, we'll see here in a minute, down in the mid-Atlantic, but way up in North Carolina and eastern Tennessee. The northern spruces are your white and your black spruce, which cannot be told from each other with distinction under magnification. You really need to move to some other sorts of science, usually genetic science or studies, to tell the two apart. So we don't know exactly which spruce we have. But if we look at where these trees would have come from, where they grew, now these are modern distribution maps, so I'll highlight the point that I have not been able to find historic distribution maps for the late 19th century for all of these species, but if we use these as a benchmark, then let's put white oak on the map. Let's put, what do we have here? Beech on the map. Let's overlap the two. You can see them shaded in this area. Let's add in yellow pine. Let's throw on all three together. Now we have this area where they all overlap. Let's add in white pine, largely a northern wood you'll see. Let's add them all together. They only really overlap in this little area here, although there is adjacency throughout the eastern Appalachian front. And then, I'll point that area out. And then let's go to spruce. That's the predominant spruce distribution, except for these pink areas of what's known as red spruce. So it's possible that we have red spruce. So if we put all of these colors together and shade in the area where we have coincidence and take that area of coincidence to the coast, this is a plausible area, not a likely, but a plausible area in which the spring break wreck could have been built. Places that we knew that all of these species were making their way to the coast, where there was an active shipbuilding industry going on at least the 19th century. The thing to go to next, which we have not been able to do but will, is strontium isotope analysis. Remember I told you about trees holding secrets? Well, they pull up strontium from the earth. I am not a strontium expert, but it varies from place to place and soil to soil. And every tree will carry within its wood a kind of a thumbprint for its strontium ratios between strontium 86 and 87. And if you know how to tell those differences and then how to compare those to benchmark locations and reference samples and collections, then you can tell within a very small regional area of distinction where your wood would have come from. So that's what's next, and that might help us. So intra-rec species distribution, a fancy way of saying where in the hell did all this wood get used in the ship? Well, if we take a 3D model of the ship and take it straight to the bare lines of all of the individual timbers and then color them accordingly to their species. We can see that we've got a pretty good collage of colors here. The dark blue here is American beech, and the lighter there is the white pine. This line right here represents the waterline of the ship. You're looking from the inside of the ship to the side of the ship, looking out. The bow is this way, to your left. So she is sailing from right to left. Very un-American of me, actually. And then these little green trunnels or wooden nails or oak. And then what else do we have in here? The red and the various reds there are spruce and pine. The exterior of the ship was entirely yellow pine. Wonderful stuff in those 60-foot up to 60-foot lengths. Highly durable. The inside of the ship was spruce. And then her framing, or the ribs that form the structure, the primary structure in the shape of the vessel, are beech below the waterline and white pine largely above. Going back to my original comment that it is not usually a good idea to put a highly dynamic thing in with a very stable thing, one of the plausibilities for the wrecking of this vessel is that it literally pulled itself apart. It does not appear to be a very old vessel. And I'll get to that towards the end of this. When was this vessel built? Well, the wood species doesn't really tell us that, but it does indicate that it was not an early colonial vessel. The early colonial times, you can imagine large forests full of big trees, long straight boles or trunks from which you could get large logs, great clear shipbuilding timber, and you wouldn't choose beech to frame your ship with. You probably wouldn't choose white pine to frame your ship with. You would have probably stayed with the venerable white oak or something like it. Very traditional, considering most American shipbuilding relied on Anglo traditions, English and some Dutch and some French and some Spanish, but mostly English shipbuilding traditions. Because the wreck came out of the ocean in an extraordinarily pristine shape, before it dried out, we were able to record saw marks or processing marks on those timbers, which lead directly to what tools were available to those who built and maintained this vessel. One of those marks we did not see was a sash saw, and you can see it is a very old type of saw dating as early as the 17th century and used well into the 19th. We didn't see those. That's what a sash saw looks like, driven predominantly by water power, sometimes by wind in the low countries. We don't have that. That's what a sash saw does to an unsuspecting log. A circular sawmill, we all know what that is. We pay extra for it on planks and put those as decorative elements in our house. We used to try to hide that part of the wood and finish it. But here you have the old circular sawmill, so known by our grandparents, still used in many mills, and it leaves a very distinct sort of sculpted series of curvilinear striations across the wood. As you see in the previous two slides here, that does not predate 1830. So now we know that a lot of these principal timbers in the shipwreck, which appear to be original, contain technology that dates to the 1830s and after. So we have eliminated thousands of years of human history. We also have the band sawmill, which is what most wood is processed in today, if you can still find a saw mark on wood, which is actually hard to do. Patented in 1808, but according to a Mr. Prescott, who wrote his own book about his own industry, which was the sawmilling industry and the bandsaw, he said that basically no one made one that would work for longer than about 20 minutes until the 1880s. And he, at first, if you read somebody's own history about their own company, you may read it with kind of a gimlet eye towards their predilection for their own truth. But he goes beyond saying something and starts citing all of the other failures through the 19th century and why they failed. And certainly his explanations probably led to his success, which was by 1885, up until 1885, there was no such thing as a production band sawmill. We have lots and lots and lots of wood in this wreck. Principal pieces, original pieces that were cut by band sawmills. And so now we've come fast forwarded to the middle of the 1880s, probably a little bit after that. This type of sawmill, there's the old band. It runs around 2 pulleys driven by steam, sometimes water, sometimes wind, and now diesel and electric. Its principal advantage is that it cuts a thinner path through the wood, which is called a kerf, lots less waste. Once we have come out of that colonial era in which wood is of low value because there's tons of it and it's never going to run out, well, by the late 19th century in the East, we're starting to run out of those big trees in virgin forests and old growth. And so wood's value increases, and so wasting less at the mill has a higher profit margin for millers. Here are bandsaw marks. They are extraordinarily regular as opposed to sash saw marks, and they were pervasive, especially in the planking, the exterior hull planking, which this is a piece. There's also sawmill marks, bandsaw marks on frames, on the insides of the frames that face the inside and the outside of this piece. You can't see the whole piece here, but you can see the marks right there. We have another technology that is on that timber, which is the old adze. Now, this is a thousands and thousands of years old technology, and it leaves these little scalloped marks you can see in the illustration up there, and you can barely see here in an oblique photograph I took of one of the insides of the frames. But you could see that beautiful scalloping, the dressing, if you will, of a shipwright worker that was taking a timber that had been cut to shape into its curve by bandsaw and then dressed with an adze, mixing a very new and a very old technology, very typical of the late 19th century. Wood characteristics. So we've talked about those a little bit, but when you look at the dynamics of the woods used, you can see that beech's dynamism here represented in the green column there versus white oak and white pine and longleaf pine. This was paired to that. So you have two very dissimilar things paired. They are held together by iron spikes, but predominantly oak trunnels. If you say tree nail about 5 times fast, you will, I guarantee, end up saying trunnel. Trunnel is a slur of those two words. And so that's why I believe, that one of the reasons this vessel may have foundered at sea, sunk in the middle of a night, maybe not in a great storm, but a little gale like we're having now, was because it came apart. It sprang a plank. Its frames were still moving and shrinking and pulling at fasteners. We also look at the type of cut. That tells us something about the mind of the processor, the mind of the builder. If you know old Edwardian and late Victorian furniture, you know quarter sawn oak. We have those beautiful ray flecks and that heavy carved furniture from the late 19th, early 20th century. And that's where you saw a plank basically this way to get the end grain showing in your wide plank. We have a beech frame here. We're looking at the frame end. And you can see that the center, the pith of the tree is very close. There's actually part of the outer bark of the tree right there. Excuse me. Showing us that we're using fairly small trees, not the big early sorts of old growth trees. Here's another one here. The outside of the tree shown and the pith of the tree right there. If we follow our radial cracking right down, the pith of the tree would have been right there. We're using small trees here. That's indicative to me of resource over-exploitation. We're talking about now the environment of the builder. And so we're probably talking about overexploited farm fields and going out and looking at trees that grew in those and at the margins of agriculture rather than in virgin forests. Again, most of the big timbers in this wreck had the pith of the tree in them. That's a white, and lots of knots indicative of trees that grew in open fields or at forest edges, rather than inside the forest where they naturally self-prune branches away as they grow up and generate nice clear wood that's free of these pesky knots that will also impart inherent weakness into a structure. More knots. This is not your big old forest white pine as this is. This is that scrabbly forest, this scrabbly tobacco field pine that you're going to go out and harvest because you have to. And not because you have a choice. This is what you're having to deal with. And so this is what a lot of Eastern America looked like by the late 19th century. It had been denuded. Go look at pictures Matthew Brady took during the Civil War throughout the eastern Atlantic seaboard, throughout the Trans-Allegheny and into the southern states. Try to find forest in the background. I challenge you. And you'll find mostly open fields like this and very little forest. This image was painted in Massachusetts in 1832. As I mentioned earlier, the white oak comes from predominantly juvenile wood, so we're not using old growth stuff, and nowhere in the wreck do we see that expected white oak plank or frame or ceiling member or knee. You can tell from the curvature if you run this curve out. These were not very big trees, and the type of that wood indicates juvenile growth. So, I've kind of said a lot of these conclusions along the way. We're dealing with a ship that was built in the late 19th century in an area that had overexploited its resources because of the use of specific materials and the way that they were paired and placed in the ship. I believe that we have mimicry rather than generations of passed down artistry. We have necessity of economic circumstances which drive innovation, which drive shipbuilding, and the need to have a ship now that may not last 30 years, but will last long enough to get through this economic boom. So that's why we believe that this vessel was built somewhere on the East Coast, maybe in the Carolinas, maybe even in the Northeast, but probably to sail around Florida as this ship was attempting to do, or just having done, and probably look something like this. When you go down and stand on the beach now and look out, it's hard to see ships. Sometimes you might see that distant barge being towed back and forth to San Juan, Puerto Rico from Jacksonville. That's about the only predominant commercial traffic you can see from the beach now. Maybe on the odd occasion a naval vessel. That was not the case 100 years ago, 200 years ago. Before we had I-95 and all of the, I'm going to come back to this image, before we had I-95 and all of the roads that interlace and connect through interstate commerce, all of our various places of business and production and consumers, we had the Big Blue, which was our highway, which is why St. Augustine's front is to the Atlantic, which is why the lighthouse is there. It's our front porch light for the nation's oldest port, and why our best side is facing the inlet. Most folks that visit St. Augustine don't get to come in the front door, they come in the back door, because where the road and the driveway has shifted. Let's go back a few slides to this slide. So what we've been looking at with the spring break wreck is basically this section right here of a vessel right in this area here that looked a lot like something like this. This was 1889 off the Northeast. But many of the ships that sailed out of Boston, out of Newport, out of New York, came down here. Many didn't stop here, but they went around because they needed to go around Florida, which for the longest period of time was one of the greatest navigational hazards to the United States, until we got it and owned it and turned it into a state and started to dot it with ports. But you had to sail around Florida, and so our main shipping channels carried thousands and thousands of this sort of wreck. They were the 18-wheeler of the 19th century. And as every 18-wheeler, as you see on 95, is not brand new and bright and shiny. There's some real lunkers out there. This spring break vessel somehow disappeared. It's quite likely that she went down without a trace in the darkness of night and just filled with water and sank. Who knows if anybody survived. But what was interesting to me, one of the things interesting to me when looking at that was, because this ship was built in the late 19th century and how small the world is, it's quite likely that somebody that visited this site, saw that wreck, is related to somebody who sailed aboard her, or sailed or helped build her, or saw her at some point. We may never know the ship's name, but we know its story. We know who was aboard it. So why are shipwrecks important to community and to society? They are greater than us. They carry all of the things that become us: material culture, concepts, ideas, diseases, peace and war. And they carry all of these concepts which transcend the forces that attempt to divide us. They carry people of every color, orientation, nationality, go on and on and on. All of the things that make us different. Maritime culture brings all of that back together. These 18-wheelers of the 19th century carried that and helped to build a modern America. That's why I think old wrecks are important. That's why I think maritime archaeology is important. It gets to people who didn't have a chance to write their story, leave a letter, sign their name. It provides a way for us to reach back to them. I want to thank you for offering the opportunity to share the story of the spring break wreck. I'll be vulnerable to questions, and thank you to Paul and Whitney Laboratory. Thanks for coming out tonight. I should also thank a few of the partners that helped make this research possible. We worked with a lot of folks in the course of this project, still are, and adding names to that throughout. So it's kind of ongoing research.